3 brutal execution attempts, not one successful hanging. On February 23, 1885, at Exeter Prison, executioner James Barry faced a task he believed was foolproof: hang John Lee for the brutal murder of 69-year-old Miss Emma Keyes at her Devon villa in November 1884. Yet every time the lever was pulled, the gallows refused to do its job, leaving Lee alive and witnesses stunned. Was this a case of divine intervention, pure coincidence, or something darker at work behind the scenes? Before we try to explain how a man could survive 3 trips to the gallows, we need to understand the crime that set these events in motion. Let's rewind to the early hours of November 15, 1884, in the quiet village of Babbacombe. At around 4 a.m., a thick column of smoke rose from the glen, the home of Miss Emma Keyes. Local fishermen Richard Harris and Coast Guard George Pierce were the first to spot the fire, and they quickly raised the alarm. Soon, more Coast Guards, Thomas Bennett and George Phillips, arrived to help battle the flames, working together in the darkness to contain the growing blaze. Their efforts would soon reveal something far more disturbing than just a house fire. Once the flames were subdued, a grim discovery awaited inside the dining room. The charred remains of Miss Keyes were found on the floor. Her throat had been cut, and her skull was fractured, clear signs that she had been murdered before the fire started. Dr. Herbert Chilcott, the local physician, was called to the scene. After examining the body, he confirmed that the head wounds were likely fatal and that the fire had been set after death, not before. The smell of paraffin on her clothing suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. As dawn broke, the investigation intensified. Police Constable Julius Meek arrived at the Glen at about 4:50 a.m., followed soon after by Police Sergeant Abraham and Superintendent Douglas Barber. The officers quickly realized that all the doors and windows were locked from the inside, raising a troubling question. If this was murder, how did the killer escape? The locked room mystery cast immediate suspicion on those already inside the house. Attention soon turned to the staff, especially John Lee, who worked as the butler and odd job man. Lee's relationship with Miss Keyes had grown tense in recent months. His wages had been cut, and he was reportedly angry about the changes. With the house up for sale, Lee and the other staff faced the prospect of losing their jobs. On the night of the fire, Lee was found by the housemaids, Elizabeth Harris and Eliza Neck, standing outside Miss Keyes' bedroom, partially dressed. According to Eliza Neck, "I saw Lee outside the bedroom door and later in the dining room where Miss Keyes' body was found. She also noticed a cut on Lee's arm, which he explained by saying he'd injured himself breaking a window to escape the smoke." Dr. Chilcott later examined the wound and described 2 circular cuts on Lee's left arm, which Lee maintained were from broken glass. The testimonies of the 2 maids, Eliza Neck and her sister, were crucial in piecing together the night's events. Both agreed that the bell pull in Miss Keyes' bedroom was in its proper place before the fire, and both recalled the smell of oil on the stairs. Eliza's sister also mentioned that a quantity of oil had recently gone missing from the house. The presence of spilled oil in multiple points of ignition suggested that the fire had been set deliberately, not by accident. Other evidence quickly mounted against Lee. William Richards, the local postman, testified that Lee had complained about his job and even made a chilling remark: "I will put an end to one in the house." The police took note of this, adding it to a growing list of circumstantial evidence. Yet the locked doors and windows continued to puzzle investigators. If Lee was guilty, how had he managed to stage a murder and fire without leaving any obvious means of escape or entry for an outsider? Speculation soon spread through the village. Some wondered if Lee could have acted alone, or if someone else in the house might have played a part. The defense would later point to Lee's half-sister, Elizabeth, who was pregnant at the time, and to other possible suspects, suggesting that the case was not as straightforward as it seemed. But in those first tense hours after the murder, Lee remained the prime suspect, and the evidence, however circumstantial, seemed to point in his direction. As the investigation moved forward, the community's shock quickly turned to anticipation. The stage was set for a trial that would grip the nation, one that promised to answer whether justice would be served or if a deeper mystery would remain. Just how did the prosecution build a case against Lee when no one else could have entered the locked villa? The trial of John Lee began on February 2, 1885, with Mr. Justice Henry Manistee presiding over the proceedings at Exeter. The courtroom was packed, the public eager for answers. Arthur Collins, Queen's Counsel, led the prosecution, while Lee's defense rested in the hands of Mr. Molesworth Street Aubin, MP. From the outset, the prosecution's strategy was clear. They aimed to prove that only Lee could have committed the murder using a web of circumstantial evidence and the peculiar circumstances of that night. Central to the prosecution's case were a series of incriminating items found in Lee's possession. Investigators had recovered a blood-stained shirt, a hatchet, an oil can, and most notably, a razor-sharp knife wrapped in grocery paper in Lee's drawer. Each object was presented as a potential tool in the crime, each stain a possible link to the murder. Dr. Stevenson, the medical expert called by the Crown, analyzed the bloodstains, but admitted that he could not conclusively identify them as human. Still, the prosecution pressed the point, arguing that the presence of these items, especially the knife and the oil can, placed Lee at the center of the crime. They also highlighted the fact that the killer must have passed Lee's bed several times between 1 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., implying that only someone with inside access could have committed the murder without detection. Witness testimony further tightened the narrative around Lee. The two housemaids, Elizabeth Harris and Eliza Neck, described Lee's unusual behavior on the night of the fire and his apparent injuries. The prosecution reminded the jury of Lee's recent anger over his reduced wages and his comments about putting an end to one in the house. They painted a picture of a man with motive, opportunity, and the means to carry out a brutal killing. But the defense was not without its own strategy. Mr. St. Aubin challenged the idea that Lee was the only possible suspect, suggesting that the real story might be more complicated. He pointed to Lee's half-sister, Elizabeth Harris, who was pregnant at the time, and raised the possibility of her lover, Reginald Gwynn Templar, being involved. The defense questioned the lack of forced entry and the fact that all doors and windows were locked from within, hinting that someone else inside the house, or with access to it, could have played a role. This line of questioning introduced the idea of an inside job, planting seeds of doubt among those following the case. The defense also scrutinized the timeline and reliability of the evidence. They argued that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial details, and that the presence of blood or oil did not directly prove Lee's guilt. The knife, they said, could have been used for household tasks, and the oil can was a common item in the house. The defense reminded the jury that Dr. Stevenson could not confirm the blood's origin and that the investigation had not ruled out other suspects. Lee himself maintained his innocence, and later, in a confession, would suggest that a conspiracy involving his half-sister and her lover might have been at play. Despite these arguments, the jury seemed unmoved. After hearing days of testimony and reviewing the evidence, they retired to deliberate. In just 45 minutes, they returned with a verdict: guilty. The speed of the decision surprised many, raising questions about whether justice had truly been served, or if the outcome had been decided before all the facts were considered. Lee was sentenced to death by hanging, his fate apparently sealed by a combination of circumstantial evidence and public opinion. With the verdict delivered, preparations for Lee's execution began. The case seemed closed, but what happened next would challenge everything the public thought they knew about crime, punishment, and fate. Then came the moment meant to be foolproof: the execution itself. On the morning of February the 23rd, 1885, the heavy bell at Exeter Prison tolled 8 times, echoing through the stone corridors as John Lee was led from his cell. Executioner James Barry, a man known for his precision and experience, had traveled from Bradford for this task. The air was thick with tension as prison officials, the chaplain, and the schoolmaster gathered to witness what was expected to be a routine hanging. Yet from the first step onto the gallows, nothing went as planned. Lee was positioned on the trapdoor, his arms and legs secured. The noose tightened around his neck. Barry gave the signal, pulled the lever, and nothing happened. The trapdoor refused to budge. For a moment, confusion rippled through the group. Barry checked the mechanism, found no obvious fault, and ordered the warders to stamp down on the trapdoor. Still, it held firm under Lee's weight. The chief constable later reported that Barry tried the lever again, not once but 3 more times, for a total of 4 pull attempts. Each time the mechanism failed, and Lee remained standing, pale and silent as the minutes ticked by. To rule out sabotage or mechanical error, Barry and the warders removed Lee from the platform and placed a heavy concrete bag in his place. When the lever was pulled, the trapdoor swung open instantly, just as it was designed to do. Satisfied that the gallows could still function, they returned Lee to the scaffold. Once more, the noose was adjusted, the lever pulled, and once more, the trapdoor stuck fast. The warders stamped and pushed, but the result was the same. The gallows, which had never failed before, seemed to defy every effort to complete the execution. Imagine the terror of standing on a trapdoor that won't open, knowing each attempt could be your last. Lee's face reportedly drained of color, his body trembling as the officials struggled to understand what was happening. The witnesses, too, grew unsettled. Some whispered about divine intervention, while others feared mechanical sabotage or incompetence. Barry, who had carried out dozens of executions without incident, grew increasingly agitated, checking and rechecking every part of the apparatus. The pressure mounted as the clock edged closer to the deadline for the Home Secretary's approval to proceed. Barry's own account reveals his frustration and disbelief. He insisted the gallows had been tested the day before and again that morning. The trapdoor, he said, had always worked perfectly under test conditions. Yet, each time Lee stood on the platform, the bolt jammed or stuck, refusing to release the trap. Barry later described the ordeal as the most bewildering experience of my career, admitting that he had never encountered anything like it. The prison officials and witnesses were left shaken, unsure whether they were witnessing a bizarre coincidence, a mechanical flaw, or something altogether unexplainable. As the failed attempts continued, the psychological strain on Lee became more apparent. He was forced to stand, bound and helpless, as the machinery of death repeatedly failed to carry out its grim task. The emotional toll must have been immense, each failed attempt prolonging the agony and uncertainty. For those present, the spectacle was both haunting and unsettling, raising unsettling questions about fate, justice, and the limits of human control. Eventually, after the 4th failed attempt, the Home Secretary was notified. The order came down. The execution would not proceed. Lee was led away from the gallows, alive but forever changed by the ordeal. The news of the failed hanging spread quickly, capturing the public's imagination and sparking debate across the country. Was it a sign from above, a simple mechanical failure, or the result of unseen hands? No one could say for certain. The aftermath of that morning would have lasting consequences, not just for John Lee, but for the very idea of capital punishment in Britain. The story of the man the gallows couldn't kill was far from over. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see Lee's fate debated in newspapers, courtrooms, and living rooms for years to come. By 8:30 a.m., the execution was postponed, and the undersheriff raced to London to meet Home Secretary Sir William Harcourt, carrying with him the urgent details of what had just unfolded at Exeter Prison. The official decision came swiftly. John Lee's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Within hours, Lee found himself back in his cell, no longer condemned to die, but instead facing the uncertainty of decades behind bars. The machinery of the law had faltered in a way no one could have predicted, and the system was left to grapple with the consequences. Lee's new reality was harsh. He spent the next 22 years in Exeter Prison, marked by the notoriety of his failed execution and the relentless attention it brought. Despite the isolation and the endless routine of prison life, Lee never wavered in his claims of innocence. He wrote letters, spoke with visitors, and maintained that he had not killed Miss Emma Keyes. This persistent proclamation set him apart from many others in his position, and it kept his story alive outside the prison walls. Newspapers revisited his case again and again, often describing him with the phrase that would come to define him, the man they couldn't hang. His time in prison was not without hardship. The years took a toll on his health and spirit, and the weight of his unique reputation only added to his isolation. Lee's story was discussed in Parliament and in public debates, with some arguing that his survival was a sign of innocence or a message from a higher power, while others saw it as an odd twist of fate. Through it all, Lee remained a figure both pitied and scrutinized, his name inseparable from the question of what had really happened that night at the Glen. On December 18, 1907, Lee was finally released from prison. He stepped back into a world that had changed dramatically since his conviction, but the public's fascination with his story had not faded. Reporters and curious onlookers followed him, eager to hear his account of those extraordinary moments on the gallows. Lee offered few details, often repeating that he remembered little of the ordeal and that he was grateful to have survived. For a brief time, he tried to build a new life, but the shadow of his past lingered. In January 1909, Lee married Jessie Bullard, hoping for a fresh start. The couple had children, and for a while, it seemed as though Lee might settle into a quieter existence. But the legacy of his failed execution and the notoriety it brought proved difficult to escape. Over time, Lee became restless and eventually abandoned his wife and children, leaving behind the family he had tried to create. He made his way to America, seeking anonymity and a chance to leave his old life behind. Even across the Atlantic, the story of the man they couldn't hang followed him, turning up in newspapers and conversations wherever he went. This unexpected transformation from a condemned man awaiting execution to a reluctant celebrity and finally to an exile became the final strange chapter in Lee's life. The failed hanging had saved him from the noose, but it had also marked him in ways he could never fully escape. His story continued to circulate, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a legend, and always as a puzzle, with no easy answers. Lee's life after the gallows invites us to consider how a single moment can alter the course of a person's fate, and how society chooses to remember those who survive the unimaginable. The questions surrounding his innocence, the nature of his survival, and the true story behind Miss Key's murder never truly faded. Instead, they became part of the larger conversation about justice, error, and the mysteries that still linger at the edges of history. So what is John Lee's true legacy? Martyr, myth, or man caught in an unsolvable crime? The story of the man they couldn't hang has taken on a life of its own, far beyond the facts of the case or even the strange events on the gallows. Lee's name is now woven into the fabric of British folklore, and the questions raised by his survival continue to echo through time. One of the most persistent threads in Lee's legacy is the controversy over his guilt. While the courts found him responsible for Miss Emma Key's murder, Lee himself never stopped protesting his innocence. Years after his release, Lee gave a confession that added a new layer to the mystery. In it, he implicated his half-sister Elizabeth Harris and her lover Reginald Gwynn Templar. According to Lee, Elizabeth and Templar were entangled in a scandalous affair, and together they conspired to kill Miss Keyes, both to silence her and to cover up their relationship. Lee claimed he was framed by the couple, forced into the role of scapegoat because of his proximity to the crime and his own difficult relationship with the victim. This confession has never been fully substantiated, but it continues to fuel speculation that the real story of the Glen's tragedy may be more complex than the official records suggest. Beyond the question of guilt, the failed execution itself remains the most compelling aspect of Lee's story. The repeated malfunction of the gallows, despite checks, repairs, and even a successful test with a concrete bag, created an event that many saw as more than mere coincidence. Some witnesses and later commentators interpreted it as a sign of divine intervention, a message that Lee was not meant to die for this crime. Others saw it as a chilling example of the limits of human control, where even the most reliable machinery can fail in the most critical moment. The chief constable's report of 4 separate lever pulls, all ending in failure, only deepened the sense of something uncanny at work. This supernatural aura has only grown over time. Lee's story became fertile ground for ghost stories, superstitions, and even folk songs. His tale has been retold in books, plays, and documentaries, each version offering its own interpretation of the events. The British folk rock band Fairport Convention even dedicated an entire album to his story, using music to explore the eerie, unresolved nature of the case. These retellings keep the legend alive, inviting each new generation to wonder whether Lee's survival Was the result a chance, sabotage, or something far stranger? The mythic quality of Lee's ordeal has also made him a symbol in debates about crime, punishment, and the ethics of capital punishment. Some see his survival as a critique of the justice system, a system that nearly executed a man based on circumstantial evidence and then failed to carry out its own sentence. Others interpret the failed hanging as a warning about the dangers of relying on machinery and procedure in matters of life and death. The story has even been used in arguments for the abolition of the death penalty, with Lee's case cited as proof that the process is never truly infallible. Yet for all the speculation, the truth about John Lee remains elusive. Was he an innocent man caught in a web of deceit? Was he guilty but spared by a fluke of fate? Or did the real perpetrators evade justice, while Lee became the unwilling face of a mystery that refuses to be solved? The enduring fascination with his story lies in its refusal to offer easy answers. Lee's life after the gallows, marked by notoriety, failed attempts at normalcy, and eventual disappearance, only adds to the sense of unfinished business. Even today, Lee's case continues to attract those drawn to the unexplained. Paranormal investigators have visited the sites connected to his life, searching for clues or signs that might reveal why the gallows failed. Writers and filmmakers return to the story, each hoping to uncover a new piece of evidence or insight. The legend of the man they couldn't hang endures because it sits at the crossroads of fact and folklore, justice, and mystery. So as we look back on John Lee's legacy, we're left with a question that still divides opinion. Was Lee the victim of a miscarriage of justice, or was there something deeper, something unexplainable at work? The debate continues, inviting each of us to weigh the evidence, consider the possibilities, and decide for ourselves where the truth might lie. The facts remain stark. 3 separate attempts to hang John Lee all failed, leaving both witnesses and experts searching for answers. Was it a mechanical flaw, an act of divine intervention, or simply a bizarre coincidence? The murder of Miss Emma Keyes and the questions about Lee's guilt or innocence only add to the puzzle. Which theory do you find most convincing? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life mysteries. John Lee cheated death 3 times, but the true mystery remains alive in our imaginations.